He only asked for a glass of water. A simple request, one that every other first-class passenger received without question. But when flight attendant Margaret Dale glanced at Henry Fontaine and his wife, Olivia, something shifted. Her tone cooled. Her gaze flickered with something unspoken. "Water isn't available right now," she said, dismissing them like they were nothing. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the couple she had just refused weren't just passengers. They owned the airline, and before this flight was over, Margaret was going to learn exactly how big of a mistake she had just made. Would she realize it before it was too late? Would she understand that in her world, the world where she decided who mattered and who didn't, the balance of power was about to shift? Before we begin, comment below where in the world you're watching from. And if you love stories that expose hidden injustices and deliver unexpected karma, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Now, let's get into the story. The air inside the first-class cabin was cool and sterile, humming with the soft murmur of passengers settling into their luxuries. The muted clink of fine china and polished silverware blended seamlessly with the low thrum of the aircraft's engines. The kind of quiet that whispered of exclusivity, of belonging at least. For some, Henry and Olivia Fontaine sat side by side, their hands resting lightly atop the armrests. They were an elegant couple, not in the way of wealth flaunted with diamonds or gaudy labels, but in the quiet refinement of people accustomed to carrying themselves with dignity. Olivia adjusted her shawl, smoothing the silk between her fingers as Henry let out a soft sigh. Glancing at the flight attendants weaving through the aisles, doling out effortless smiles and drinks as though the sky itself had deemed these passengers deserving of its grace. Their row had been passed over. Henry, never one to assume the worst of people, waited a moment, watched as crystal glasses of water, golden pools of champagne, and the rich, burgundy hues of fine wine were placed in the hands of their fellow travelers. The older man seated diagonally from them received a refill before he had even lifted the glass to his lips. The woman in pearls, 2 rows ahead, barely had to glance up before her needs were met. Still, Henry waited. He had been raised with patience, taught that dignity was something a man carried within him, regardless of how the world saw fit to test it. The lead flight attendant, Margaret Dale, moved efficiently, her posture erect, her uniform crisp. As she approached their row, her gaze flickered, briefly, over Henry and Olivia before shifting past them, already anticipating the next request. Henry offered a polite smile, his voice smooth, practiced. "Excuse me, ma'am, would you mind bringing us some water?" Margaret hesitated. It was brief, so brief that an untrained eye might not have caught it. But Henry caught it. He had lived long enough to recognize that kind of pause. The kind that was more than just a moment's forgetfulness. The kind that held a calculation. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression betraying nothing as she looked at her tray, half-full glasses of untouched water balanced carefully. Then, with a measured shake of her head, she said, "I'm sorry, sir, but water isn't available right now. We'll be serving drinks later." A slow beat of silence passed. Henry felt Olivia's fingers tighten ever so slightly against the fabric of her shawl. "I see," he murmured. He did not press, did not demand, did not give her the satisfaction of knowing she had been caught. Margaret turned without another word. The moment should have been insignificant, a small inconvenience in the grand scheme of the flight. But there are moments in a person's life that swell, that expand beyond their edges, that carry the weight of generations. Henry could feel it, pressing into his bones, as Olivia finally exhaled beside him. Across the aisle, a young flight attendant, Teresa Grant, watched, her fingers curled around the tray she held, her stomach twisting with something she did not yet know how to name. She had been working under Margaret for a year. She had seen this before. Not just here, on this flight, but in stores, in restaurants, in the way the world sometimes decided, silently but unmistakably, who was worthy of attention. She hesitated. Then, as quickly as the thought had come, she pushed it away. There was nothing to be done. Henry sat back in his seat, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. Olivia, ever the observer, turned the page of her book without reading a word. If someone had been watching closely, truly watching, they might have noticed the way Henry's jaw tensed, the way his eyes flickered, sharp and assessing, as Margaret refilled glasses just a few feet away. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky. But the cabin had become heavy. The weight of unspoken things had a way of settling in, wrapping around people like invisible chains. Henry reached into the pocket of his jacket. His movements slow, deliberate. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his saved messages, his thumb hovering over a single contact labeled Operations HQ. He did not send the message. Not yet. Instead, he placed the phone gently on his knee, his fingers tapping softly against its edge. Margaret laughed at a passenger's joke 2 rows ahead. The hum of the aircraft continued. The drinks were poured. The service carried on. But something had shifted. And before this flight was over, Margaret Dale would realize just how costly a simple glass of water could be. The plane had leveled into its smooth ascent, the cabin settling into a quiet rhythm of hushed conversations and the faint clinking of glasses. Overhead lights cast a soft glow, illuminating the elegance of first class, the tailored suits, the manicured hands grasping at crystal. Everything had the careful arrangement of a world designed to run on unspoken rules. Rules that everyone seemed to know. Everyone except those who were never meant to belong in the first place. Henry Fontaine sat still, his fingers no longer tapping against the armrest. He had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of stillness, of not reacting in the face of small slights. He had learned that the world expected certain men to be grateful for whatever crumbs of civility they were offered, to ignore when they were passed over, stepped around, rendered invisible. He had learned that even dignity, when carried in the wrong hands, could be mistaken for defiance. Olivia turned a page in her book, but her eyes had not moved across a single sentence. She didn't need to look at her husband to know what he was feeling. How many times had she sat beside him in rooms where their presence was questioned? In spaces where people decided their worth before they even spoke? Margaret Dale continued her rounds, pouring champagne with ease, exchanging light laughter with passengers whose very existence seemed to assure her that everything was in its right place. She did not glance back at the Fontaines. She did not need to. She had already made her decision about them. A few feet away, Teresa Grant felt the weight of something she couldn't name pressing against her ribs. The unease had started the moment Margaret denied the Fontaines their water. But it had grown, settled in her stomach like a stone. She knew better than to interfere. Knew that there were consequences for challenging the unspoken order of things. But still, her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the placement of a tray. The thing about injustice, the quiet kind. The kind that does not arrive with slurs or open violence but in careful omissions. In looks that pass too quickly. In polite refusals that taste of disdain, is that it does not stay contained. It spreads. It festers. It waits for a moment to be exposed. Henry reached for his phone again. His movements slow, controlled. He had spent his life making careful calculations about when to speak and when to let silence do the talking. But he had learned something else. Too, there were moments when silence was its own kind of surrender. His message remained unsent, but not for long. The call came through to the cockpit 20 minutes later. Captain David Wells frowned as he read the incoming message from Operations HQ. It was brief but direct. Verify service standards for priority passengers Henry and Olivia Fontaine. Priority passengers. Wells shifted in his seat, his years of experience telling him there was more to this than the neutral language suggested. He turned to his company pilot, a younger man with a rigid posture and an eagerness to prove himself. Do we have any reports of service issues in first class? Wells asked, his voice level. The co-pilot checked the logs, shaking his head. No complaints filed, sir. Wells exhaled through his nose. A slow, measured breath. He had been in this business long enough to know that not all complaints made their way into reports. Some passengers did not bother filing them, not because they had no complaints, but because they had learned that certain grievances were easier to ignore than to fight. Patch me through to the lead flight attendant, Wells said. The call was placed. Margaret Dale was mid-conversation when the in-flight phone buzzed. She excused herself, walking briskly toward the galley before picking up. This is Margaret Dale, first class lead, she said smoothly. Miss Dale, this is Captain Wells. I need you to confirm the status of passengers Henry and Olivia Fontaine. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened ever so slightly. Everything is fine, Captain, she replied, keeping her voice even. They haven't raised any issues. A pause. Then why? Wells asked, his voice calm but firm. "Did the owners of this airline file a direct report about mistreatment on this flight?" Margaret's stomach dropped. She had made a mistake. Not in what she had done, no. She had done what she had always done. What she had been trained to do. What the world had always assured her was normal. Her mistake was in assuming she knew who she was dealing with. Her mistake was in thinking that Henry Fontaine was just another man in first class. Another passenger who could be ignored without consequence. Her mistake was in forgetting that some people have the power to upend the order of things. And now, she was going to pay for it. Teresa watched as Margaret set down the phone with stiff fingers. She saw the way the older woman's face tightened. The way her lips thinned into a strained line. Something had shifted. The air felt different, heavier. Margaret turned toward the Fontaine's row. Her posture suddenly too upright. Her hands smoothing her uniform as though she could press the mistake out of existence. Teresa had seen this before. Too, the moment when realization dawned. When people who had built their lives on assumptions suddenly found themselves scrambling for control. She could feel it coming. Something was about to happen. And Margaret Dale was running out of time before everything changed. Margaret Dale had spent years perfecting the art of control. She understood people, how they moved, how they spoke, and, most importantly, how they could be managed. She had learned to navigate first class like a chessboard, placing her attention where it belonged, withholding it where it did not. She knew who needed extra care, who required charm, who could be dismissed without consequence. It had always been that way. Until now. The call from the captain sat heavy in her chest. A warning, a shift, a reminder that she had miscalculated. She could feel the weight of it as she turned toward Henry and Olivia Fontaine. Still seated in quiet composure. They had not demanded anything, had not raised their voices. And yet, something about their stillness unnerved her. It was the kind of patience that was not submission, but strategy. Margaret smoothed the fabric of her uniform, inhaled slowly, and made her way toward them. The first-class cabin had settled into a rhythm, passengers flipping through newspapers, scrolling through phones, sipping from fluted glasses. But there was something different now. A subtle shift in energy. A few heads turned, passengers sensing a quiet disturbance, an unsaid tension that ran beneath the hum of the aircraft. Margaret reached their row, her smile perfectly practiced, her voice carefully modulated. "Mr. and Mrs. Fontaine," she said, as if addressing them for the first time. "I wanted to check if you're comfortable and if there's anything I can bring you." Henry looked at her for a long moment. The silence stretched, pulling tight like a rope about to snap. Then, he smiled, slow and deliberate. "Ah," he murmured, "now you ask." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding earlier," she said quickly. "I'd be happy to bring you that water now." Olivia tilted her head, considering Margaret with quiet amusement. "You seemed rather busy before," she said lightly. "What change?" The words were gentle, but they landed with weight. Margaret opened her mouth, searching for a way to smooth over the misstep, to push past the moment as if it had never happened. But she was too late. Across the aisle, Teresa Grant watched, her hands tightening around the tray she carried. She had seen Margaret operate long enough to know the difference between authority and panic. And right now, Margaret was panicking. The young flight attendant wasn't sure what to feel. A small part of her thought, this is what happens when you assume too much. When you decide who matters and who does not. But another part of her, the part that had learned to stay quiet. To avoid conflict. To not make herself a target, felt uneasy. Because she knew what was coming. Power was shifting, and those who had spent their lives holding it did not give it up easily. Margaret nodded stiffly, forced another smile, and turned quickly on her heel, retreating to the galley. By the time she reached the service area, her hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the counter, steadying herself. She needed to regain control. She needed to fix this before it unraveled further. But then, the in-flight phone rang again. Margaret hesitated, her breath coming too fast. Slowly, she picked up. "This is Margaret Dale." The voice on the other end was not Captain Wells this time. "This is Everett Fontaine." Margaret's body went rigid. The founder of Fontaine Airways. The man whose name was etched into the very fabric of the airline. Whose influence reached beyond boardrooms and corporate policies. A man who did not tolerate mistakes. "My son has informed me of an issue on board." Everett's voice was smooth, But there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. I would like you to explain it to me personally. Margaret's throat was dry. I assure you, Mr. Fontaine, there was no issue. She stammered. Just a simple misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, Everett repeated, his voice unnervingly calm. Tell me, Miss Dale, is it standard procedure to deny service to first-class passengers who have paid for every courtesy? Margaret swallowed hard. Of course not, sir. It was not my intention. I am not concerned with your intention. Miss Dale. The line went quiet for a moment, but it was the kind of silence that did not offer relief. I expect my passengers to be treated with respect. All of them. Margaret's grip tightened around the phone. Yes, sir. When this flight lands, Everett continued, his voice unwavering, I will expect a full report from you. In the meantime, I suggest you ensure that my son and daughter-in-law receive the highest level of service. Immediately, the line went dead. Margaret stood frozen, gripping the phone like it might anchor her against the sudden shift in power. This was not just a mistake. This was a disaster. When she returned to the cabin, her composure was brittle, barely holding together. She carried a tray with 2 glasses of ice water. Her steps measured, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers now. The way they followed her movements with quiet curiosity. They had seen her ignore the Fontaines before. They had watched her dismiss them. Now they were watching her correct herself. She stopped beside their seats and placed the glasses on the tray table with practiced grace. Your water, sir. Ma'am. Henry didn't pick up the glass immediately. Instead, he studied it for a moment, then looked up at her. Interesting, he mused. Margaret forced a polite smile. Is something wrong, sir? Olivia lifted her glass, tracing the rim with her fingertip. Oh no, she said, her voice soft. It's just, this seems like such a simple thing to do. Henry nodded slightly. And yet, he said, his voice quiet but firm, it wasn't done when we first asked. Margaret felt the heat rise in her face. I apologize if there was a misunderstanding. She tried again, her voice faltering. Henry chuckled under his breath. A misunderstanding, he repeated, as if turning the words over in his mind. He leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the armrests. Tell me, Miss Dale, was it really a misunderstanding? Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. The cabin had gone quiet now. Passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. She opened her mouth, searching for an explanation, but none came. Henry watched her, patient, unhurried. Then, without looking away, he reached for his phone. Margaret's breath caught. A single message, one more call, and she knew her career. Her authority, everything she had built was hanging by a thread. The balance of power had shifted. And Margaret Dale was no longer in control. The first-class cabin was not the same place it had been an hour ago. The illusion of peace, of effortless luxury, had begun to crack. The air hummed with something different now. Something that unsettled, that demanded attention. Conversations grew quieter. Glances lingered longer. People who had been content to ignore the Fontaines before now found themselves watching. Waiting, trying to decipher the shift in power that had sent Margaret Dale walking stiffly down the aisle. Her posture too rigid, her movements too controlled. Henry Fontaine, however, was at ease. He sipped his water, slow and deliberate, as though it was the finest drink he had ever tasted. Olivia Fontaine, ever the quiet observer, flipped through the pages of her book with the same patience she had exhibited all her life. But anyone who looked close enough could see it, the careful way she held herself. The sharp glint in her eyes. She was not reading, she was waiting. Across the aisle, Teresa Grant could barely keep still. She had seen injustice before, small moments. The kind that most people pretended not to notice because they were easier to forget. She had spent years watching people like Margaret Dale decide, in an instant, who mattered and who did not. She had swallowed it down, convinced herself that it wasn't her place, that the system had its rules, and she was just a part of it. But now, something was unraveling before her, something that could not be ignored. Margaret had returned to the galley after delivering the water, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as if she could steady herself against the weight of what was happening. The call from Everett Fontaine still echoed in her mind, his voice even, but carrying a quiet authority that had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She had made a mistake. She had spent years deciding who was worthy of her time. Who belonged in the spaces she controlled? It had never occurred to her that one day she would find herself on the other side of that equation. The in-flight phone buzzed again. Margaret swallowed hard before picking it up. "This is Margaret Dale." Captain Wells' voice was tight. Clipped. "Miss Dale, I trust you've resolved the situation with Mr. and Mrs. Fontaine?" "Yes, Captain." A pause. Then, "Good, because when we land, there will be a report waiting for you with the airline's executive team. I suggest you start thinking about how you'll explain this." Margaret's grip tightened around the phone. "Captain, Miss Dale," Wells interrupted, his voice cold. "Final. That will be all." The line went dead. The weight of what was coming settled into Margaret's chest as she returned to the cabin. She had lost control, and everyone knew it. Passengers who had not noticed the exchange before were noticing now. A man in a navy suit whispered something to his seatmate. A woman 2 rows ahead glanced toward the Fontaines. Her expression unreadable. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed, and Margaret felt it like a living thing pressing against her ribs. And then, the moment she had been dreading arrived. Henry Fontaine stood up. The movement was unhurried, but it was enough. The quiet murmur of the cabin dimmed as he adjusted his jacket. His posture exuding the kind of power that came from knowing exactly who he was and who the world had tried and failed to make him believe he wasn't. Margaret's breath caught as he turned toward her. "I'd like to speak with the captain," Henry said, his voice calm, steady, but carrying an undeniable weight. Margaret hesitated. "Sir, Henry smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Miss Dale." Margaret opened her mouth, closed it again. She had no control left. Not here, not anymore. Teresa Grant, watching from her post, felt something stir inside her, a flicker of something she had buried too many times before. She took a slow breath, then stepped forward. "Sir, I'll take you." Margaret's head snapped toward her, but Teresa did not flinch. For the first time, Margaret was the one being ignored. Henry nodded once, approvingly, and followed Teresa toward the front of the cabin. Margaret remained frozen in place, her pulse thrumming painfully against her skin. She turned, desperate for something, some sign that she was still in control. That was when she noticed the other passengers. Not just watching, judging. She had always prided herself on being able to command a room, to ensure that everything, and everyone, stayed exactly where they were supposed to be. But now, she was the one being scrutinized. And for the first time in her career, Margaret Dale understood what it felt like to be the person people decided was not worth their time. Inside the cockpit, Captain Wells listened as Henry Fontaine spoke, his voice calm but unyielding. "This was not a misunderstanding," Henry said. "It was a choice. And it's a choice your airline will need to answer for." Captain Wells said nothing at first. He had spent years flying, had seen all kinds of conflicts arise in his cabin. But this was not an ordinary complaint. This was something that could not be brushed aside. "I understand, Mr. Fontaine," Wells finally said. "Rest assured, this will be addressed." Henry held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "That," he said, "would be wise." When Henry returned to his seat, Olivia finally set her book aside. "All handled?" she asked. "For now." Olivia exhaled softly, then reached for his hand. Margaret had not moved from her spot near the galley. She stood still, stiff, staring straight ahead as though she could will herself into disappearing. She had learned a lesson today, though whether she would acknowledge it was another matter entirely. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone on that flight had felt it. Teresa Grant, watching from across the cabin, let out a slow breath. For the first time, she did not feel invisible. And for the first time, Margaret Dale did. The flight continued, but nothing was the same. By the time they landed, the consequences would be waiting. The plane moved steadily through the sky, but the cabin was far from calm. Something had shifted. The silence that had once been comfortable, the easy rhythm of luxury and exclusivity, had been broken. Passengers who had once been absorbed in their own affairs were now listening more carefully, watching with quiet curiosity or unease. They could feel it, the tension, the power shifting, the unspoken rules of first class being tested in ways they had not anticipated. Margaret Dale, the senior flight attendant, stood near the galley, gripping the counter so tightly that her nails dug into the polished metal. She could still feel the weight of Henry Fontaine's voice, His calm but cutting words. She had spent years deciding who mattered, who was worth her time. Now, she was the one being examined, the one whose actions were under scrutiny. She had made a mistake. No, she had made many mistakes. And now, she was waiting for the fallout. Henry Fontaine sat with quiet patience, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze steady as the world around him continued to shift. He had seen this before, this moment of realization when power is questioned. When the careful arrangement of things begins to tilt, and those who have always been in control suddenly find themselves on unsteady ground. Olivia Fontaine sat beside him, her expression unreadable. She had spent her life moving through rooms that were not made for her, walking past people who saw her but did not see her. She understood, better than most, how power worked, and she understood something else, too. Margaret Dale was unraveling. Not loudly, not in a way that most would notice. But Olivia saw the way her hands trembled when she reached for a glass. The way she avoided looking directly at them. The way her confidence, the confidence of someone who had always believed herself to be right, was beginning to crack. She would not admit her mistake. That was not how people like Margaret worked. But she was feeling it. And that, for now, was enough. Teresa Grant stood a few feet away, pretending to adjust a tray. But her attention was elsewhere. She had never seen Margaret like this, uncertain, thrown off balance. Teresa had spent too long biting her tongue, watching injustice unfold in small ways, knowing that if she spoke up, she would be the one who suffered. But this was different. She had done something this time. She had chosen to stand beside the Fontaines. She had chosen to be a part of the shift, rather than another bystander pretending not to see. She wasn't sure what that meant yet, but it felt like the beginning of something. The in-flight phone buzzed. Margaret flinched, then quickly smoothed out her uniform before reaching for it. "This is Margaret Dale," she said, her voice tight, too rehearsed. It was Captain Wells. "Miss Dale." His voice was quiet, but firm. "We need to talk." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Of course, Captain," she managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll see you in the cockpit in 5 minutes." The line went dead. Margaret placed the phone down slowly, carefully, as if setting a trap that might spring back at her. She exhaled, then straightened her shoulders. She was still the senior flight attendant. She had still worked for this airline for over 15 years. She would explain. She would fix this. She had to. Inside the cockpit, Captain Wells sat with his hands folded. He had been a pilot for a long time. He had flown politicians, billionaires, celebrities. He had seen the way people carried themselves in first class, the way power moved in the air as easily as turbulence. And he had seen what happened when someone challenged that power. Henry Fontaine had not yelled. He had not caused a scene. But he had made a call. And now, Everett Fontaine, the owner of this airline, the man whose very name was printed on the fuselage of the plane, was waiting for an explanation. Margaret entered the cockpit, her posture stiff but composed. "Captain," she said, forcing a smile, "I understand you wanted to speak with me." Wells did not return the smile. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit down, Miss Dale." Margaret hesitated just for a second but then obeyed. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then, in a voice quiet enough to be dangerous, he asked, "What the hell were you thinking?" Margaret's breath caught. "Captain, No," Wells interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't explain it to me. Explain it to Mr. Fontaine. Because in less than an hour, we land in New York. And I have to walk off this plane and face him." Margaret swallowed hard. "It was a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "A simple mistake." Wells leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Miss Dale, you refused service to the owners of this airline. You treated them as if they did not belong in a cabin they own. Do you understand how serious that is?" Margaret's fingers clenched in her lap. She had built her career on being right, on knowing people, on controlling situations. And now, she was watching her control slip through her fingers like sand. She had not just made a mistake. She had made an unforgivable one. Back in first class, Henry Fontaine reached for his phone again. He did not need to call his father. Not yet. He wanted to see what Margaret Dale would do next. Would she apologize? Would she try to act as though nothing had happened? Would she, at last, acknowledge what she had done? Olivia turned to him, her voice quiet. "Do you think she understands yet?" Henry exhaled. shaking his head. People like her don't understand. Olivia, they don't learn, not really. But they remember. Olivia murmured. Henry nodded. Yes, he said softly. They do. Margaret had spent her life deciding who mattered. But now, for the first time, she was the one being decided on. The flight continued, the engines humming beneath them. But everyone knew when they landed, nothing would be the same. The hum of the engines was steady. But the air inside the first-class cabin was anything but calm. There was a stillness, a strange and unnatural hush that settled over the passengers, a silence that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with anticipation. They all knew something had happened. The quiet, polite indignity of the earlier moment had spread like a ripple across still water, disrupting the carefully controlled atmosphere of luxury. And now, with each passing minute, the tension grew, thick as a storm pressing against the fuselage. Margaret Dale sat stiffly in her jump seat, her posture too perfect, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles had gone white. She had spent years navigating first class with the ease of someone who knew the rules, not the ones written down, but the ones enforced in glances, in pauses, in polite refusals. She had followed those rules today. And yet, for the first time in her career, they had turned against her. Henry Fontaine had been waiting, not just for the landing, but for the moment when people like Margaret Dale could no longer hide behind their uniforms, their authority, their carefully measured professionalism. He had been a businessman long enough to know that real power was not in the moments when things were running smoothly, but in the moments when things fell apart. And Margaret was falling apart. Not in a way that most passengers would notice, not yet. She was still composed, still moving through the motions of her job with forced precision. But Henry saw it in the way she wouldn't meet his gaze anymore. The way she hesitated before speaking, as if weighing every word, every movement, every choice. He had seen this before. The moment when people realized they had miscalculated. Teresa Grant, standing near the galley, felt her pulse quicken. She had spent the last year learning how to keep her head down, how to follow orders without questioning them, how to see injustice and look away. But she had done something today. Something that could not be undone. She had chosen a side. And now, standing there, watching Margaret's thinly veiled panic, she felt something she had not felt before: power. She had no illusions about what came next. Margaret would not take the fall alone. Someone would have to be blamed for this. And Teresa had spent her whole life knowing who got blamed first. The intercom crackled, the captain's voice breaking through the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into New York. Please ensure that your seat belts are fastened and all electronics are turned off. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Margaret felt her stomach twist. 20 minutes until the flight was over. 20 minutes until she stepped off this plane and walked into whatever consequences were waiting for her. Her mind raced through possibilities, through excuses, through ways to explain, to justify what had happened. But what could she say? That she hadn't meant to offend? That she had simply been following procedure? That it had been a misunderstanding? She had used those words before. They had always worked before. But they wouldn't work now. Not when she had denied service to the owners of the airline. Henry Fontaine could feel the shift in the cabin. It was subtle, but it was there. Passengers who had once ignored him were now watching him out of the corners of their eyes. Not out of concern, not out of guilt, but out of curiosity. Who was he? Why had his presence changed everything? How had he, without raising his voice, without making a scene, managed to disrupt the quiet hierarchy of first class? Henry had spent a lifetime watching people like them try to figure him out. They did not understand how a man like him could move through the world with the kind of confidence that did not require validation. They had spent their whole lives believing that their comfort, their presence, their wealth was the natural order of things. And yet, here he was proof that the world was changing in ways they did not understand. Margaret took a slow, steadying breath. She turned her gaze toward the Fontaines. And for the first time, she let herself really see them. Not as passengers, not as inconveniences, as people. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She did not know how to fix this. Because this was not something that could be fixed. This was something that would follow her. Not just after the landing. Not just after the next report. But in every decision she made from now on. Because she had seen it. She had felt it. The weight of what she had done. The realization that she had not been in control at all. She had only been playing a role in a system that had long since decided its winners and losers. And today, she had been the one to lose. The plane tilted gently as it descended through the clouds. New York was waiting. The world below did not yet know what had happened here. But soon, it would. And when Margaret Dale walked off this plane, she would not be the same person who had boarded it. Because some mistakes are too big to ignore. And some lessons come too late to undo. The descent had begun, but inside the first-class cabin, everything remained suspended. The plane cut through thick clouds. Its body steady, its engines unwavering, but the world within had already changed. Margaret Dale sat rigid in her jump seat, her pulse drumming in her ears, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She was no longer counting minutes until landing. Now, she was counting consequences. The weight of her choices sat in her chest like a lead weight, growing heavier with each moment. She had spent her career believing she knew how to read people who needed attention, who could be ignored, but she had been wrong. And now, Henry Fontaine's quiet, patient presence was a reminder of just how wrong. Henry Fontaine had felt this before. Not just the turbulence of a plane shaking against the air, but the turbulence of being watched. He could feel their eyes on him, passengers who had sat in comfort, in certainty, who now looked at him with something they did not fully understand. Was it curiosity? Was it discomfort? Was it fear? It was always something like this. He had built his fortune in rooms that had not been made for him. Built his empire in spaces where men like him had been tolerated, but never welcomed. He had spent decades watching people like Margaret Dale decide, in an instant, who belonged and who did not. But the thing about power was that it did not belong to those who held it the longest. It belonged to those who knew when to take it. And today, he had taken it back. Margaret swallowed hard as the first real shake of turbulence rippled through the cabin. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat. She had spent years telling herself she was good at her job, that she treated everyone with the same professionalism, the same care. But now, she could see it, the pattern of her choices. She had assumed, she had dismissed, she had refused, and worst of all, she had not even thought twice about it. Until it was too late. She closed her eyes. She would apologize. Yes, she would fix this. Maybe she would not lose everything. Maybe she would explain. But before she could decide how to begin, the intercom crackled. "This is Captain Wells. Flight attendants, please take your seats for landing." Margaret's hands clenched against her lap. Too late. Teresa Grant watched from her seat, barely breathing. She had never seen Margaret like this. Not stiff with authority, not brisk with efficiency, but small. Margaret, who had always carried herself like she owned the air around her, now sat shrinking, her shoulders drawn in, her face pale. Teresa should have felt satisfaction. She didn't. She just felt the weight of it all. Because Margaret was just one person in a long, unbroken chain of them. This wasn't just about Margaret. This was about every person who had ever been dismissed. And that was far bigger than one flight. Henry reached for his phone. He wasn't calling anyone. Not yet. He just held it, let the weight of it rest in his palm. Margaret saw the movement, even from across the cabin. Her stomach twisted. Was he going to call Everett Fontaine again? Was he going to make sure that this was the final mistake of her career? Her throat was dry. She opened her mouth. And then, another jolt. The plane dipped sharply. Just for a second. A pocket of turbulence sending glasses clinking. A murmur of unease rippling through the cabin. Margaret sucked in a breath, gripping the edge of her seat. She had never liked turbulence. The way it reminded her viscerally, undeniably, that no one, not even those who thought themselves in control, were ever really in control. The plane leveled out again, the shaking settling. But Margaret did not, because she realized, with terrifying clarity, that the turbulence had already happened. Not outside, inside. And it was still happening. Henry placed his phone back into his jacket. Did not call. Did not move. Just sat. And that, somehow, was worse. Margaret felt something she had not felt in years. Not discomfort. Not irritation. Dread. Because she did not know what was coming next. And that, for the first time, terrified her. The runway lights came into view. The landing gear unfolded beneath them. The city stretched out below. Waiting. The world was still moving forward. But Margaret Dale knew when she stepped off this plane, she would not be stepping into the same world she had left behind. The city spread out below them, its lights flickering against the night like signals from another world. The plane was descending now, smooth and steady, but the air inside the cabin was anything but. The silence had changed. It was no longer the kind born of luxury, of people resting easily in their seats, comfortable in their own importance. No, this silence was heavier, stretched tight over the cabin like a thin sheet of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest misstep. Margaret Dale sat frozen in her jump seat, her body rigid, her breathing shallow. She had always believed in order, believed that if she followed the rules, her rules, everything would remain in its rightful place. But now, nothing felt right. She had lost control, and for the first time, she understood what it meant to be at the mercy of someone else's decision. Henry Fontaine remained still, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his expression unreadable. He had not moved since placing his phone back into his pocket. Had not said a word. And that was what terrified Margaret most of all. She knew now that she had done something that could not be undone. That her choices, thoughtless, instinctual, made without hesitation, had consequences. What she did not know was what Henry planned to do next. Would he call his father the moment they landed? Would she be met at the gate by airline executives, her years of service reduced to a single mistake? A single moment of exposure? Would she be stripped of everything she had built simply because she had miscalculated? She wanted to apologize. The words sat on her tongue. But she knew that no apology could fix this. Because she wasn't sorry that she had done it. She was sorry that this time, it had cost her something. The wheels touched the runway with a soft, controlled thud. The plane slowed, the engines humming low as they taxied toward the gate. Margaret's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She had always loved this moment, the finality of landing, the smooth closure of another flight well executed. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, the runway felt like a countdown. Every second that passed was 1 second closer to whatever judgment awaited her. She glanced toward Henry Fontaine, but he had already turned away, gazing out the window as if this had all been just another flight. Margaret almost wished he had been angry, that he had yelled, made a scene, given her something to fight against. Instead, he had simply waited, and that was worse. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Passengers stirred, stretching, gathering their belongings. Conversations began again, but softer now, careful, as if people sensed that something had shifted, that the air was no longer as safe as it had once been. Henry Fontaine rose slowly, adjusting his jacket with quiet precision. Olivia Fontaine stood beside him, smoothing the silk of her scarf. Margaret swallowed hard. This was it. Henry turned, his gaze meeting hers for the briefest of moments. She braced herself, but he said nothing. He did not acknowledge her, did not offer her the dignity of a response. Instead, he stepped into the aisle, moving with the slow, deliberate ease of a man who had won a battle without ever needing to fight. Margaret's stomach twisted. She had been erased, the same way she had spent years erasing others. The Fontaines moved toward the exit. As they reached the front of the cabin, Captain Wells stepped out of the cockpit. "Mr. Fontaine," he said, nodding in acknowledgement. His voice was careful, measured, carrying the weight of someone who understood that this was no ordinary passenger. Henry smiled politely. "Captain." Margaret watched, waiting for something, for the blow to fall, for her fate to be sealed in real time. But Henry Fontaine simply nodded, then stepped off the plane. Gone. Margaret let out a shaky breath. Was that it? Had she been spared? The passengers filed out, row by row, until the cabin was nearly empty. Teresa Grant lingered near the galley, watching Margaret with something unreadable in her eyes. Margaret turned away. She didn't need Teresa's judgment right now. She needed to think, needed to understand what had just happened. And then, the in-flight phone buzzed. Margaret's breath hitched. She reached for it with trembling fingers. "This is Margaret Dale," she said, her voice barely steady. The voice on the other end was not Captain Wells. It was Everett Fontaine, the voice of the man who owned the airline. The voice of the man who had built the very thing she had believed she had authority over. The voice of the man who had just received a full report from his son. Margaret's throat went dry. "Miss Dale," Everett Fontaine said, his voice calm, terrifyingly calm. "I trust you had an eventful flight." Outside, Henry Fontaine walked through the terminal. The quiet hum of an airport at night surrounding him. He did not look back. He did not need to. Because people like Margaret Dale always learned the same lesson. Sooner or later, some people would always believe they had the right to decide who mattered. But today, she had learned what it felt like to be decided against. And Henry Fontaine knew that was a lesson she would never forget.